You think you understand power because you have a job title or because people listen when you speak. But a German professor at 24 years old walked through a breakdown, built a philosophy from wreckage, and changed how every person after him thinks about strength. Not the strength to lift or the strength to command. The strength to create your own values when everything you believe turns to ash. This is about the mental process Friedrich Nietzsche went through to understand power, and it's going to change how you see reality. Most people talk about Nietzsche like he was born with these ideas, like he just woke up one day and decided God was dead. They skip the part where he was a pastor's son from a town called Rücken near Leipzig. They skip October 15th, 1844. They skip his father, Karl Ludwig, dying before Friedrich turned 5, leaving him in a house with 5 women, his mother Franziska, his sister Elizabeth, his grandmother, 2 aunts. They skip 14-year-old Nietzsche entering Schulpforta, a boarding school built inside a former Cistercian monastery from 1137 Honoir, stone chapels and rigid discipline. They skip him reading the German Romantics, Hölderlin and Jean-Paul Richter, and David Strauss's Life of Jesus that stripped the myths away. But here's what matters. In 1865, at age 21, Nietzsche walked into a bookstore in Leipzig and found Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, from 1818, just sitting there. He said later he didn't know what demon whispered to him to take that book home. He read it, and something cracked open. If you value documented philosophy and intellectual history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, published March 17th, 2017 by Brian Leiter and updated continuously, and from Nietzsche Studien, the primary academic journal for Nietzsche scholarship founded in 1972 and published by de Gruyter, which contains peer-reviewed articles including Gregory Whitlock's 1996 study on Boscovich's influence and Keith Ansel Pearson's 2000 work on Nietzsche's force dynamics. These aren't general summaries. These are the places where scholars spend decades working through a single fragment. Now back to the information. Schopenhauer told him the world wasn't rational, the world wasn't progress, the world was blind will, aimless striving, suffering without purpose. The only escape was negation. Denying the will to live, becoming nothing. Nietzsche was 21 and his brain was on fire. He followed his professor Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl from Bonn to Leipzig in 1865. Ritschl taught Plautus, the Roman comic poet from 254 to 184 BCE. Nietzsche started publishing in Ritschl's journal, the Rheinisches Museum, the only student ever to do that. Then in 1866, right after Schopenhauer, Nietzsche read Friedrich Albert Lange's History of Materialism and Critique of its Present Significance. Lange said metaphysics was poetic illusion. Lange also mentioned a Croatian physicist named Roger Joseph Boscovich, who died in 1787. Boscovich rejected materialistic atomism. He said matter wasn't little solid balls, matter was centers of force, dynamic points from which force emanates. Extended matter explained by something not matter. Nietzsche kept that in his head. As early as 1872, he was studying Boscovich's Theoria Philosophiae Naturalis for himself. Then in 1867, military service, equestrian field artillery near Naumburg. March 1868, chest injury trying to mount a horse. The wound wouldn't heal. Back to Leipzig on sick leave. November 1868, he met Richard Wagner at the home of Hermann Brockhaus, an Orientalist married to Wagner's sister. Wagner was born 1813, exactly the age Nietzsche's father would have been. They both loved Schopenhauer. Wagner was magnetic, genius, operatic. For young Nietzsche, this was everything. Then January 1869, the University of Basel offered him a professorship in classical philology. He was 24. He hadn't finished his dissertation. The University of Leipzig just gave him an honorary doctorate in March 1869 because Ritschl said he'd never seen anyone like this in 40 years. Basel made him extraordinary professor, then full professor in 1870, the youngest ever to hold that chair. You need to understand what happened next because it's where the mental process starts. War breaks out, the Franco-Prussian War. Nietzsche volunteers as a medical orderly in August 1870. Within a month, he's accompanying wounded transports and contracts, dysentery and diphtheria. His health is ruined permanently. He's back in Basel by October with a teaching load. 8 hours a week at the university, 6 more at a local gymnasium. His body is breaking, but his mind is building. He publishes The Birth of Tragedy in 1872. It's not normal philology. It's about Apollonian form and Dionysian chaos, about how Greek tragedy emerged from these forces. His colleagues hate it. Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mühlendorf mocks it as future philology. Even Ritschl calls it megalomania. Nietzsche tries to transfer to philosophy. Basel says no. He's isolated. Between 1873 and 1876, he writes The Untimely Meditations, 4 essays attacking David Strauss, questioning history's value, praising Schopenhauer and Wagner. But by 1876, at the Bayreuth Festival, Nietzsche is disgusted. The shows are banal, the public base. His friendship with Wagner is dying. 1876 to 1881. 5 years. This is the furnace. Nietzsche's health collapses. Migraines so bad he can't see. Vomiting. Diarrhea sieges. His dresser looks like a pharmacy. He takes a year's leave in 1876, resigns completely in 1879. He's 34, and his academic career is over. He lives in small rented rooms in Italy and the Swiss Alps, trying to control his life through daily rituals. No more Wagner. No more Schopenhauer's pessimism. He meets Paul Rée, who in 1876 convinces him to dismiss that early pessimism, and here's where the shift happens. In Daybreak, published 1881 var, Nietzsche starts talking about Machtgelust, desire for power. The pleasure of feeling power and the hunger to overpower. He's breaking Schopenhauer's will to live, which Schopenhauer said was aimless suffering, and replacing it with something else. The will doesn't just exist, it seeks expansion, it seeks more. Then 1882. The Gay Science, 5 books in the original edition, a 5th book added in 1887. Section 13 of The Gay Science says all human actions are motivated by the desire to increase the feeling of power, not to survive, not to conserve, to expand. Section 108, God is dead. Section 125, the madman in the marketplace asking what we did when we unchained the earth from the sun. Section 341, the demon comes to you in your loneliest loneliness and tells you you'll have to live this life again and again, eternally. Would you curse the demon or call him a god? Eternal recurrence, the ultimate test of affirming life, and underneath it all, this drive. This Wille zur Macht, will to power. Between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche writes Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a prose poem, not a treatise. Zarathustra comes down from the mountain and teaches the Übermensch, the overman, the person who creates values beyond good and evil, the person who says yes to life, who embraces eternal recurrence, who channels will to power into self-overcoming. But Zarathustra is poetry. What Nietzsche needed was argument. So, in 1886, he publishes Beyond Good and Evil at his own expense through C. G. Naumann in Leipzig. This book has 11 references to will to power, more than any other published work. Section 12 mentions Boskowitz and declares war on soul atomism. The idea of solid, Verurteilung, separate selves is dead. What exists is centers of force, bodies striving to become master over space, extending their force, thrusting back resistance. Every body encounters similar efforts from other bodies, and they come to arrangements, conspiracies for power. The world is dynamic struggle, not static being. If you value documented philosophy and intellectual history like this, keep watching. The depth here matters. We're not giving you surface takes. We're showing you exactly how a thinker moved from one position to another with dates, texts, sources. Now back to the information. Section 13 of Beyond Good and Evil attacks Spinoza for making self-preservation fundamental while rejecting teleology. Nietzsche says no. Life isn't about preservation. Life is will to power. Even when something looks like self-preservation, it's a consequence of the will to exert strength outward. The general condition of life is not struggle for existence. That's Darwin's mistake. The drive for conservation appears only in exceptions. Most life forms aren't just trying to survive. They're trying to expand, grow, dominate. Appropriate. Look at section 259. A living thing wants above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. Now here's what people miss. Nietzsche didn't pull this from nowhere. In 1883, he read Charles Dumont and Wilhelm Roux and Carl Nageli. Dumont talked about pleasure in the expansion of power. Roux talked about internal struggle in organisms. Nageli's 1884 book, Mechanische Physiologische Theorie der Abstammungslehre, Potsdams, which Nietzsche acquired around 1886 and read closely, talked about the drive toward complexity. And William Rolfe, this is crucial, Rolfe's 1884 book, Biologische Probleme, argued for insatiability and assimilation as fundamental. Not adaptation, not survival. Assimilation, taking in, expanding. Nietzsche fused all of this. Dumont's pleasure in expansion, Rous's internal struggle, Nagelli's complexity drive, Rolf's insatiability. This became the biological side of will to power. These were anti-Darwin evolutionists, and Nietzsche used them to build an anti-Darwinian explanation. Adaptation and survival are secondary. The primary drive is expansion of power, but it goes deeper than biology. Remember Boskowitz from 1872, forces, not matter. Nietzsche began developing a physics of will to power in his notebooks through the 1880s. Fragment 38 from 1885, Notebook 12, the world as a play of forces and force waves, simultaneously one and many, concentrating and dispersing. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence. This isn't published in his lifetime, but it's in his notebooks. The will to power becomes cosmological, not just a psychology, not just biology, but a fundamental characterization of reality. Matter as centers of will to power, every quantum of power characterized by the effect it exercises and what resists it, a will to violation and resisting violation, the struggle all the way down. Here's what Nietzsche understood that wrecks most people's assumptions. Power isn't about domination of others. That's a secondary effect. Power is about self-overcoming. It's about imposing your will onto yourself. Craft versus mocked. Craft is primordial force, raw strength that anything can exercise. Mocked is the conscious channeling of craft for creative purposes, for transformation, for building. This is sublimation. This is culture. This is art. In section 257 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes about noble morality versus slave morality. The noble type creates values from a pathos of distance, a feeling of rank, of excellence distinguished from the common. Good means powerful, happy, wealthy. Bad means common, vulgar, low. But slave morality inverts this. The slaves, powerless and oppressed, develop resentment, festering resentment. They call their masters evil. They call their own weakness good. They invent an afterlife where the meek inherit everything. This is the transvaluation. This is Christianity taking Greek and Roman values and flipping them. On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887. Nietzsche tracks this in 3 essays. First essay, Master Morality versus Slave Morality. The priestly class, especially the ancient Jews after the Babylonian defeat, turned resentment into a system. They hated the warrior aristocrats who enslaved them. They brought into their religion hatred toward the noble, toward power, toward the ruling orders. This spreads to Christianity and becomes the dominant moral system of Europe. Second essay, Bad Conscience. Once humans can't discharge their instincts outward, when they're civilized, contained by society, they turn those instincts inward. They attack themselves. Guilt emerges. The entire apparatus of conscience is will to power turned inward, self-torture. But it's also the source of depth, of inwardness, of the soul. Third essay, Ascetic Ideals. Priests, philosophers, artists all embrace asceticism, the denial of life, because it gives them power over others. The ascetic says, you should suffer, deny yourself, and I'll show you how. It's a form of power when you have no other power, but it's nihilistic. It says life itself is worthless. 1888. Nietzsche is in Turin, warm climate for his health. He's 44. He writes Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ex Homo, the Wagner Case, all in this final productive year. In Twilight section 11 he writes, what does not kill me makes me stronger. That becomes the most misunderstood line in philosophy because people think it's about endurance. It's not. It's about transformation. It's about taking resistance and using it to grow, to become harder, more refined. In Ex Homo he writes, I am not a man, I am dynamite. He knows what's coming. In December 1888, his letters change. He stops signing Friedrich Nietzsche. He signs Dionysus. He signs Nietzsche Caesar. He signs the Crucified. Witnesses in his house report 3 days and nights where he stays locked in his room, naked, playing piano, singing, dancing wildly. One-man Dionysian festival. Recreation of the ecstatic ancient rituals he wrote about in The Birth of Tragedy 17 years earlier. January 3rd, 1889. Turin, Piazza Carlo Alberto. Reports vary, but the common story, Nietzsche walks out of his lodging at Via Carlo Alberto number 6. He sees a coachman whipping a horse. Brutal blows. The horse won't move. Nietzsche rushes over, throws his arms around the horse's neck, collapses. Unconscious. 2 policemen approach. Public disturbance. His landlord takes him home. Over the next few days, Nietzsche writes the Wahn Briefe, the madness letters, to Jacob Burckhardt. I have had Caiaphas put in fetters. I was crucified by German doctors last year. To Cosima Wagner, Ariadne, I love you. Signed, Dionysus. January 6th, Burckhardt shows the letter to Franz Overbeck. January 7th, Overbeck receives his own letter and travels immediately to Turin. January 8th, Overbeck finds Nietzsche curled on the edge of a sofa, manuscript for Nietzsche. Contra Wagner pulled an inch from his eyes. Nietzsche dashes across the room, embraces Overbeck, returns to his corner. He babbles about being the new Dionysus, brought to earth to redeem mankind. Moments of lucidity with references to his coming fame. Overbeck gets him to a psychiatric clinic in Basel, January 10th to 17th, then to Jena under Otto Binswanger's care. January 18th, 1889 to March 24th, 1890. The question scholars still fight about: was the collapse related to his philosophy? Was it syphilis, which was diagnosed at the time but challenged later? Was it a retroorbital meningioma? A brain tumor behind his right eye, as recent studies from 2013 suggest? Was it CADASIL, frontotemporal dementia, manic depressive illness with periodic psychosis followed by vascular dementia? In 1898 and 1899, 2 strokes partially paralyzed him. By 1899, he had clinical hemiparesis on his left side, couldn't speak or walk. Pneumonia mid-August, 1900. Stroke during the night of August 24th to 25th. Dies at noon, August 25th, 1900. Age 55. But here's what matters. From January 1889 until his death, 11 years, he never writes another publishable word. The productive life ends with the horse. His mother Franziska cares for him until her death in 1897. Then his sister Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche takes over. Elisabeth returned from Paraguay in 1893 after her husband Bernhard Förster's suicide. They'd been trying to establish an Aryan anti-Semitic German colony called Nueva Germania. Elizabeth takes control of Nietzsche's unpublished works and his legacy. She edits, she curates, she distorts. The Nazis later used Nietzsche's ideas about the Übermensch and will to power to support their ideology, completely missing or deliberately ignoring his anti-nationalism. His contempt for German culture, his explicit condemnations of anti-Semitism in sections like Beyond Good and Evil, section 251, where he praises Jews for upholding respect for ancient Greek philosophy and for giving the world Christ, Spinoza, and the most effective moral code. But by then, Nietzsche can't speak. He sits in silence in Weimar while visitors come, including Rudolf Steiner in 1895, who writes one of the first books praising Nietzsche. Elizabeth tries to get Steiner to tutor her on her brother's philosophy. Steiner gives up after months, declaring it impossible to teach her anything. During those 11 silent years, Nietzsche's works finally reach an audience. Beyond Good and Evil sold only a few hundred copies when he self-published it in 1886. He gave away most of them. But by 1890, Georg Brandes is lecturing on Nietzsche at the University of Copenhagen. By the late 1890s, the books are spreading across Europe. After his death in 1900, the influence explodes. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler all read him. Adler's individual psychology borrows heavily from Will to Power. The 1912 book Über den nervösen Charakter cites Nietzsche's will to power and will to seem, connecting sensation of pleasure to feeling of power and pain to feeling of feebleness. Adler's holistic integrity of psychological well-being with social equality contrasts with Freud's pleasure principle and Viktor Frankl's later logotherapy, or will to meaning. Existentialists, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, wrestle with him. Postmodernists, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, build on him. Foucault declares himself Nietzschean, using genealogical method to expose power dynamics in knowledge, institutions, discourse. Here's the mental process Nietzsche went through step by step. First, exposure to Schopenhauer at 21 in 1865. The world is blind will and suffering. Second, rejection of pessimism through 1865 to 1876. If the will is aimless suffering, why accept it? Why not transform it? Third, influence of Lange and Boscovich starting 1866 and 1872. Matter is force, dynamics, not static substance. Fourth, break with Wagner and Schopenhauer 1876 to 1881. Pessimism is weakness, life denial, resentment masquerading as wisdom. Fifth, development of Machtgelust in Daybreak, 1881. The drive isn't to live, it's to feel power expanding. Sixth, articulation of will to power in the Gay Science, 1882. All action motivated by increasing the feeling of power. Seventh, integration of biology and anti-Darwinism, 1883 to 1886. reading Dumont, Roux, Negley, Rolfe, fusing their ideas into a theory where expansion trumps survival. Eighth, cosmological extension in Beyond Good and Evil. 1886, not just psychology or biology, but a fundamental characterization of reality as dynamic struggle of force centers. Ninth, historical genealogy in On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, showing how master and slave moralities emerge, how resentment inverts values, how Christianity spreads life denial. 10th, final synthesis in the 1888 works, Life Affirmation. Eternal recurrence as testede, as Dionysian embrace of chaos and creation, transvaluation of all values. This isn't a philosophy of might makes right. Walter Kaufmann spent decades in the 1950s through 70s correcting that misreading, showing how often Nietzsche's power is about self-control, self-overcoming, cultural excellence, not domination of others. When Nietzsche says will to power, he means the drive to actualize one's will unto oneself first. The sculptor shapes the stone, the artist shapes the canvas, the free spirit shapes their own values. Domination of others is a crude, secondary expression of power, with the weak mistake for strength because they don't understand creation. The Übermensch isn't a dictator. The Übermensch is the person who creates new values after God is dead, who says yes to life, including its suffering, who loves fate, amor fati, because they see necessity as beautiful, who dances on the edge of the abyss without needing the comfort of metaphysical absolutes. Here's what changes when you understand this. You stop thinking power is about controlling other people. You stop thinking strength is about never showing weakness. You realize the strongest act is to look at everything you believed. God, morality, truth, meaning, and let it die if it's life-denying. Then you build something new from the wreckage, and not a return to barbarism, not cruelty for its own sake, but a reevaluation, a transvaluation, a creation of values that affirm existence. Nietzsche called this the philosophy of the future. Philosophers of the future would be free spirits, experimenters, those who risk dangerous maybes, who don't need certainty, who embrace perspectivism, the idea that all knowledge is interpretation from a particular perspective, that there are no facts, only interpretations, that truth is a mobile army of metaphors. Section 43 of Beyond Good and Evil. Whatever is profound loves masks. The most suffering spirit would have to be the most cheerful, the spirit that has suffered most, that has descended deepest, that has overcome most, creates the brightest laughter. This isn't nihilism in the sense of giving up. This is nihilism overcome. You go through the death of God, through the collapse of meaning, through the terror of eternal recurrence, and you emerge saying yes, yes to the whole thing. Yes to the suffering that made you who you are. Yes to the possibility that you'll have to live it all again infinitely. Because anything less is weakness disguised as virtue, slave morality disguised as goodness, resentment disguised as concern. Section 276 of the Gay Science. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all and on the whole. Someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. This is the end point of the mental process. Affirmation. Not blind optimism. Not denial of suffering. But the amor fati, the love of fate. The capacity to transform it was into a thus I willed it. To take what happened, even the worst of it, and say, this made me. I wouldn't undo it. I am the consequence of this struggle, and the struggle made me powerful. And power here, remember, is not power over others primarily. It's power over yourself, power to create, power to endure and transform. When Nietzsche writes in Exe Homo about his illness, he says his sickness gave him tools. It forced him to philosophize differently. It forced him to question the value of life, health, suffering. He wouldn't trade it. That's the final move. Reinterpreting your damage as your advantage, your weakness as the source of your depth, your suffering as the fire that refined you. Not because you wanted to suffer, but because you can say, I grew through this. I wouldn't be who I am without it. Therefore, I affirm it. The standard scholarly interpretation remains contested. Maud Marie Clark's 1990 book, Nietzsche. Truth and philosophy argued against the traditional metaphysical reading of will to power. She said Nietzsche was playing games in section 36 of Beyond Good and Evil, putting on a mask, not advocating a cosmological doctrine. But Peter Shostet Hughes and others have convincingly shown this interpretation dismisses too much. The notebooks from 1883 to 1888 contain over 100 sections on will to power. Lou Salamaeus' 1894 book, written while Nietzsche was still alive, though incapacitated, describes his theory of will to power as metaphysical. as his attempt to merge his former views into a single framework. She knew him personally before the collapse. The Nachlass fragments show Nietzsche working toward a book called The Will to Power through the 1880s, planning sections like the will to power as knowledge, the will to power in nature, the will to power in society, the will to power as art. He never finished it because he collapsed in 1889. What's documented beyond dispute. Nietzsche spent 18 years from the birth of tragedy in 1872 through his collapse in 1889, building a philosophy that started with Schopenhauer's will and Boskovich's force dynamics, rejected Schopenhauer's pessimism, integrated biological and evolutionary challenges to Darwin, extended the concept to psychology and morality and culture, and finally to cosmology, and culminated in the idea that reality is fundamentally will to power, not stasis, not being, not substance, but dynamic striving, expansion, self-overcoming, creation and destruction in perpetual play. The eternal recurrence seals it. If everything repeats infinitely, only the person who affirms life completely, who loves their fate, who says yes to existence including all its horror and pain, can bear it. That person is the Übermensch, beyond good and evil, creating values, dancing on the abyss. 2017 study from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Brian Leiter and updated continuously. Nietzsche's will to power describes what he may have believed to be the main driving force in humans, self-determination. Actualizing one's will onto oneself or surroundings, heavily coinciding with egoism, but not domination. 2018 article in Nietzsche's Studien, Volume 47 by Joshua Raymond on representationalism in Nietzsche's early physics. 2019 article by Connor Husbands in Nietzsche, Studien, Volume 48 on Boskovich, and the extent of the analogy to Nietzsche's 1873 time atom theory. 2020 article in Philosophia Scientiae by Vitor Luis de Souza, arguing Nietzsche used Boskovich's concept of force as more fundamental than matter, to think about the world in terms of forces in struggle. These aren't old debates, this is current scholarship. People working through fragments, comparing notebooks to published works, tracking influences. And here's the late reveal that reframes everything. The horse, January 3rd, 1889. Whether it happened exactly as reported or not, the symbol matters. Nietzsche spent his life arguing for strength, for hardness, for self-overcoming, for saying yes to life's cruelty and struggle. Then he saw a horse being whipped and he collapsed. Some scholars, like Milan Kundera, say Nietzsche was trying to apologize to the horse for Descartes. For the entire Western tradition that treated animals as soulless machines, for the philosophy that denied suffering in anything non-human, others say the horse was just the trigger, that the collapse was already coming from the tumor or the illness. But think about what it means. The philosopher of power, at his most productive moment, creating his most radical works, sees suffering he can't transform into affirmation. He sees pure pain without meaning, and something breaks. Or maybe nothing breaks. Maybe the collapse was the culmination, the final Dionysian ecstasy, the total dissolution of ego into chaos. Maybe those 3 days locked in his room playing piano, naked and dancing wild were the achievement. The thing he'd been moving toward all along, losing the self. Becoming purely will, purely affirmation, purely music. And then the long silence, 11 years without words, sitting in Weimar while the world reads his books and misunderstands and uses them and fights over them. Maybe the silence is the final teaching. After all the words, after all the philosophy, there's only existence. No explanations, no justifications, just being. The cold final line from the sources. By August 1900, Nietzsche had suffered multiple strokes, was paralyzed on his left side, couldn't speak or walk. Pneumonia took him in mid-August. Final stroke during the night of August 24th to 25th. Death at noon, August 25th, 1900 in Weimar, age 55. The philosopher who said, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," died from accumulated weaknesses. The philosopher who preached self-overcoming was overcome. The philosopher who embraced eternal recurrence ended in silence, unable to articulate whether he would have willed it all again. But the works remain, beyond good and evil, on the genealogy of morality. Thus spoke Zarathustra. The gay science, twilight of the idols, ex homo, and, in those works, a mental process, from pessimism to affirmation, from will to live to will to power, from slave morality to noble values, from resentment to amor fati, from nihilism to transvaluation. That process is the answer. That's what changes how you see reality, not the final position, the movement itself, the courage to let God die, to let meaning collapse, to stand in the void and say, "Now I create." You think the silence of those final 11 years was the end, but in reality, It was the incubation period for the most dangerous explosion of thought in the 20th century. Friedrich Nietzsche died at noon on August 25th, 1900, but the entity that rose from his grave was a monster constructed of half-truths and deliberate manipulations. To understand the full scope of the mental process, you have to look at what happened to the philosophy when the philosopher could no longer defend it. This isn't just about the corruption of an archive. It is about the terrifying responsibility that falls on you when you actually attempt to live the ideas he proposed. Most people stop at the death of God. They don't realize that was merely the clearing of the construction site. The real work, the work that breaks people, is building the cathedral of the self on a foundation of absolute nothingness. Consider the immediate aftermath. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, the sister he called a vengeful anti-Semitic goose, seized control of the Nietzsche archive in Weimar. She didn't just publish his works, she curated a persona. She took fragments from his notebooks, those private laboratories of thought where he tested ideas he wasn't ready to publish, and she stitched them together into a non-existent book called The Will to Power. Published in 1901 and expanded in 1906, she dressed the invalid philosopher in white robes like a prophet for photographers. She invited the German elite to gaze upon him, and slowly, she wove his concept of the Übermensch, the spiritual aristocrat who conquers himself, into the crude political narrative of German nationalism. This is the tragedy of the first half of the 20th century. A philosophy of individual liberation was weaponized into a tool for collective tyranny. It took until the 1950s, specifically the work of Walter Kaufmann in Princeton, to translate the texts accurately and scrub away the barnacles of fascist ideology, revealing the existentialist thinker underneath. But let's go deeper into the mechanism of the Übermensch, because this is the part you are likely getting wrong. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes the three metamorphoses of the spirit. This is the roadmap. First, the spirit becomes a camel. The camel is the beast of burden. It says, "Put a load on me." It wants to bear the heaviest weight. This is you learning the discipline of your culture, the rules of your society, the rigor of science or art. You cannot transcend what you have not yet mastered. You must carry the weight of "thou shalt." But in the loneliest desert, the second metamorphosis occurs. The camel becomes a lion. The lion wants to capture freedom and be master in its own desert. The lion fights the great dragon called "thou shalt." The lion's spirit is "I will." It destroys old values. It creates a sacred no, even to duty. But the lion cannot create new values. It can only destroy the old ones to make space. That is why the third metamorphosis is necessary. The lion must become a child. Why the child? Because the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. The child plays. The child creates values not out of reaction to the past, but out of the pure affirmation of the present. Most people never get past the camel. A few become the lion and destroy themselves in rebellion. Almost no one becomes the child. This brings us to the most terrifying diagnostic Nietzsche offered for the modern age, the last man. In the prologue of Zarathustra, he presents the counter-ideal to the Übermensch. The last man is the ultimate result of a civilization that prioritizes safety, comfort, and equality above all else. The last man says, "We have invented happiness," and blinks. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. No shepherd and one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. This is the prophecy of the 21st century. A world where suffering is viewed as a technical error to be eliminated rather than a forge for greatness. A world where the highest goal is a long, painless life and a peaceful death. Nietzsche despised this. He looked at the last man and saw a creature that had forgotten how to despise itself, and therefore forgotten how to grow. To be a creator, you must be a plastic surgeon of your own soul, cutting away the parts that are rotting, even if it hurts. Now, return to the concept of eternal recurrence, because the physics of it matters less than the psychology. In the gay science, section 341, the question isn't whether the universe actually repeats. The question is the weight of the thought. If you knew that this moment, right now, with all its boredom, its frustration, its heartache, and its fleeting joy, would recur infinite times, would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This is the litmus test for life affirmation. It destroys the idea of an afterlife, which Nietzsche saw as a slander against this life. If there is no heaven, no hell, no final judgment, then the weight of your actions is here and now. If this moment repeats forever, then this moment is infinitely important. You cannot say, I will endure this now so I can be happy later. There is no later. There is only the eternal now returning. This forces a radical responsibility. You have to live in a way that you would be willing to immortalize. This connects directly to his critique of truth. Nietzsche was the first to really see that God is dead didn't just mean the end of religion. It meant the end of objective truth. If there is no divine architect, there is no God's eye view. There is only perspective. Section 374 of the Gay Science. We simply lack any organ for knowledge. For the power truth, we know, or believe, or imagine, just as much as may be useful in the interest of the human herd, the species. And even what is here called utility is ultimately also a mere belief. Something imaginary, and perhaps just that most calamitous stupidity of which we shall perish someday. This is perspectivism. It doesn't mean all views are equal. It means that objectivity is a myth. A strong will imposes its perspective on the world. A weak will adopts the perspective of others. Science, for Nietzsche, wasn't the opposite of religion. It was the latest shadow of God, another system claiming to have the absolute, cold, detached truth. He wanted a gay science, a knowledge that dances, that recognizes its own partiality, that serves life rather than dissecting it. You must understand the physiology of his thought. Nietzsche constantly linked philosophy to the body. He talked about ideas having a smell. He talked about the digestion of experiences. In Exe Homo, he writes about diet tea, about climate, about the importance of dry air and metabolism. This wasn't trivial. He was arguing that your spiritual state is a physiological state. Resentment is a poisoning of the blood. Idealism is a symptom of a nervous system that cannot handle reality. The soul is just the stomach of the mind. When he says, become who you are, he isn't talking about finding a hidden true self. He is talking about a biological and psychological sculpting process. You are a multiplicity of drives, anger, lust, curiosity, fear. The task of the powerful individual is not to extirpate these passions, as the ascetic priest does, but to organize them, to act like a conductor of an orchestra, making the fear and the lust and the anger play a symphony. This is what he meant by style. To give style to one's character, a great and rare art, it is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. The legacy of Nietzsche in the 20th and 21st centuries is the legacy of this challenge. Existentialism picked up the burden of freedom. Post-structuralism picked up the burden of power and language, but the personal challenge remains unsolved for most. We are living in the age of the shadow of God. The institutions are crumbling, the shared narratives are fracturing, and we are seeing the rise of the nihilism he predicted. Passive nihilism says, nothing matters, so I will just consume and entertain myself. Active nihilism says, nothing matters, so I will destroy what exists. Nietzsche offered a third way. Nothing matters inherently, so I am free to create meaning. This is the most difficult path. It requires a hardness that modern society labels as toxic, and a sensitivity that modern society labels as weakness. It requires you to be both the chisel and the stone. So, if you are looking for the conclusion of the mental process, it is not in a book. It is in the action you take when this video ends. The philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche is not a set of beliefs to sign up for. It is a set of tools for the dissection of your own illusions. It is a hammer. You use it to tap on the idols of your life, your career, your relationships, your morality, your politics, and listen for the hollow sound. If it sounds hollow, you smash it. And in the debris, you look for the piece of yourself that is indestructible. That is the will to power. That is the only thing that survives the eternal recurrence. The German professor at 24 years old didn't walk through a breakdown just to give you something to read. He walked through it to show you that the human spirit is capable of killing its gods and surviving the solitude. But the question remains, hanging over the silence of the last century. Are you the camel, the lion, or the child? Because the desert is getting larger, and woe to him who hides deserts within himself.